What happens when a billionaire CEO, feared for his ruthless deals, is brought to silence by the voice of a secretary? No one noticed Claire Whitmore was 35, with worn shoes, a sick mother at home, and bills that never seemed to end. Nathaniel Logan was 44, heir to an empire, groomed to win at any cost. They should have never crossed paths. And yet, in one boardroom on one ordinary morning, Claire spoke up and the entire room stopped breathing. From that moment, their lives collided. He represented power, legacy, and compromise. She carried scars of injustice, the quiet anger of a family destroyed by corporate greed. Could love grow in such hostile soil? Could integrity survive inside the glass towers of wealth? This is not just a story about romance. It is about courage, betrayal, second chances, and the impossible fight to reconcile two worlds. And at its heart lies one haunting question: can a single secretary change the course of a billionaire's empire? And his heart. If you believe in stories of redemption, resilience, and love that dares to transform, then stay with us. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. And now, let's begin. Claire Whitmore paused at the bottom of the glass tower that loomed above downtown Minneapolis. Logan Industries rose like a mirror to the sky, its panels gleaming against the pale spring sun. She tugged at the sleeves of her worn blouse, smoothing fabric that had been ironed twice to hide its thinning seams. Her shoes, scuffed at the toes, pinched slightly with every step. Still, she lifted her chin. A life could change in a single morning. She had to believe that. Inside the lobby, the air smelled faintly of polish and perfume, as though even the walls had been scrubbed to project wealth. Marble floors reflected the click of heels and the muted rustle of expensive suits. Claire clutched her folder tighter, aware of how invisible she seemed in this river of power. To others, she might have looked like just another applicant, another secretary hoping for a desk. To her, this was survival. At 35, she had no margin left. Her mother's heart condition had worsened through the winter. Bills had piled up beside bottles of pills. Her younger brother Ethan was counting on a scholarship, but even with it, there would be fees to cover. Claire had patched together work for years, temporary contracts, administrative stints, but never anything stable enough to build a future. She told herself that today might be different. The receptionist checked her name, offered a smile that was more procedure than warmth, and handed her a badge. "Conference room 12, the woman said crisply, already turning to the next guest. Claire followed the signs, her pulse climbing with each step. The room was larger than she expected, a long, polished table beneath a ceiling studded with recessed lights. Men and women in tailored suits filled the seats, papers stacked neatly in front of them. At the head of the table sat Nathaniel Logan. He was younger than she imagined, mid-40s, but carried himself with a kind of authority that made the room tilt toward him. Dark suit, silver watch, posture straight as a ruler. His eyes, sharp and cool, swept over the table before settling briefly on her. Claire felt the gaze like a weight. She reminded herself to breathe. The meeting began at once. It was not an interview, not in the ordinary sense. She had been called to assist with note-taking for a logistics acquisition, a chance to prove she could handle pressure. If she succeeded, there might be a contract at the end. If she failed, she would walk out into the spring air unemployed once more. Nathaniel's voice filled the room, smooth but unyielding. He spoke of margins, of timelines, of market expansion. Executives chimed in with numbers, their words overlapping like machinery. Claire kept her head down, pen moving quickly across her pad. She had done this work before, transcribing, recording, watching from the sidelines. She knew how to be invisible, but as pages of the proposal slid across the table, something caught her eye. A clause buried deep in the agreement, its language precise yet slippery, liquidated damages in the event of breach. She read it again, lips parting slightly. The wording tilted heavily in favor of the supplier, exposing Logan Industries to penalties far beyond what was reasonable. It was the kind of clause that could cost millions if mishandled, and no one at the table seemed to notice. Her pen stilled, her heart thumped. She told herself to stay silent. This was not her place. She was here to observe, to write, to leave without disturbance. Yet the thought of her mother's medicine, of Ethan's college forms, pressed hard against her chest. If she said nothing, and this deal collapsed months from now, would anyone even remember the secretary who might have warned them? She cleared her throat. It was a small sound, but in the hush of calculation, it carried. Heads turned. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. Yes, Ms. Whitmore. Her voice almost failed her, but she forced it steady. This damages clause. It exposes the company to significant liability. If the supplier defaults, Logan Industries could be held responsible for costs that exceed standard benchmarks. It's written in a way that assumes unlimited risk on your side. The room froze. For a beat. The only sound was the faint hum of the air system. One executive shifted uncomfortably, as though she had broken some unspoken rule. Another frowned down at his copy, scanning the lines. Claire felt heat flood her cheeks. Perhaps she had ruined everything. Nathaniel reached for the document, his fingers deliberate. He read quickly, then more slowly. His jaw tightened. The silence stretched, every second an eternity. Finally, he looked up, meeting her eyes with something unreadable, part irritation, part recognition. She's right, he said at last. His tone clipped. This would never hold in arbitration. Who approved this draft? Murmurs broke out. A senior counsel cleared his throat, muttering about oversight, about revisions that had slipped through. Nathaniel's expression hardened. He closed the folder with a sharp snap. The executives shifted in their chairs. The power in the room had tilted, just slightly, toward the woman at the end of the table. Claire kept her gaze low, though inside her pulse thundered. Nathaniel studied her again. Not the way a man looks at a woman, but the way a strategist evaluates a new variable on the board. His next words were unexpected. Ms. Whitmore, you'll remain with this team. Effective immediately. Her head lifted, startled. He didn't elaborate, didn't smile, didn't soften, but his decision was final, the weight of it closing the conversation. Claire gathered her papers with hands that trembled just enough to betray her nerves. She could feel the stares of the board members, some curious, some dismissive, a few even resentful. She told herself not to shrink. She had spoken because it was right, because she couldn't ignore what she saw. As the meeting adjourned, Nathaniel stood, buttoning his jacket. He glanced at her one last time, a look impossible to decipher, then strode from the room. Claire remained seated a moment longer, the imprint of his gaze still lingering. She knew one thing whatever had just begun. It was larger than an interview, and it was only the first step into a world that could break her or change her forever. Morning came in two very different ways. For Claire Whitmore, it was the hiss of the old radiator in her small apartment on the edge of Minneapolis. The window panes rattled against a stubborn spring wind, and the kitchen smelled faintly of instant coffee mixed with detergent from last night's dishes. She spooned dark powder into a chipped mug, poured hot water from a kettle whose handle was wrapped in tape, and stirred until the liquid turned a dull brown. The first sip was bitter, but it was warmth, and that was enough. Bills lay on the counter beside her mother's pill bottles. The orange containers glowed under the dim light, reminders of a heart that needed daily care. Claire checked the labels automatically, counting out tablets, setting them near a glass of water. Margaret would wake soon, moving slowly, her breath shallow. In the bedroom, her younger brother Ethan was already awake. A stack of college brochures spread across his lap. He tried to look excited, but Claire caught the flicker of worry in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. Tuition loomed like a mountain, even with scholarships. She forced a smile, kissed his head, and promised silently that she would find a way. By 7, she was out the door, coat buttoned against the chill, shoes tapping unevenly along cracked sidewalks. She boarded the bus downtown, pressed between commuters with earbuds and tired faces. The air smelled of damp wool and cheap coffee. Claire clutched her bag and stared out the window, the city blurring past. Across town, Nathaniel Logan's morning unfolded with the precision of a Swiss watch. Sunlight glinted off the still surface of Lake of the Isles, filtering through the wide windows of his glass-walled home. The kitchen counters gleamed, white stone polished smooth. A housekeeper set a crystal glass filled with fresh-pressed juice beside a plate of sliced fruit. His personal trainer waited in the gym downstairs. Nathaniel's day began with a swim, 20 laps across his heated pool, followed by a shower that steamed the mirrors. He dressed in a tailored suit, cufflinks glinting at his wrists, before settling into a sleek car that waited at the curb. His schedule, printed neatly on an embossed card, mapped every hour until midnight. The contrast could not have been sharper. One woman measuring pennies against pills, one man measuring profits against markets. Yet, by 9 a.m., both would occupy the same floor of Logan Industries Tower. Claire arrived early, badge clipped to her blouse. She was now officially assigned to assist the CEO's office, though no one had bothered to explain what that meant. Colleagues in the administrative pool exchanged looks when she walked in. Some smiled too sweetly, others ignored her altogether. By mid-morning, she understood their game. Files misplaced on her desk that belonged 2 departments away. Coffee orders whispered as though she were a waitress. A suggestion that she should fetch dry cleaning, though it wasn't part of her job. Each request was small, but together they carried a sting. They were testing her, measuring how far they could push the new girl. Claire handled each moment with quiet precision. She returned files to their rightful owner without apology. She brewed coffee for herself, not for them, offering a polite smile that ended the conversation. And when the dry cleaning request came, she simply said, "I'm here to support the executive office, not run errands. Perhaps facilities can help." Her voice was calm, steady, unbothered. What she didn't realize was that Nathaniel had noticed, from his corner office, he could see more than people assumed. The way Claire's shoulders stiffened when she walked past a cluster of assistants. The way she held her ground without raising her voice. He watched, curious, as though studying a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. Nathaniel prided himself on reading people quickly. Most employees bent under the weight of his gaze, eager to please, eager to prove loyalty. Claire was different. She didn't fawn, didn't scramble to gain favor. She did her work carefully, with a kind of quiet dignity that unsettled him. That afternoon, he called her into his office. She entered cautiously, pad and pen in hand, expecting instructions. He studied her across the expanse of polished wood, his expression unreadable. "I'll need you to manage my schedule directly," he said. His voice was even, clipped, as though he were discussing weather rather than altering her role entirely. Claire blinked, unsure she had heard correctly. Most secretaries rotated tasks, shielding the CEO through layers of assistants. To be handed his calendar, his hours, was to step into the eye of the storm. "Yes, sir," she answered, though her pulse quickened. He leaned back, watching her. "You'll coordinate with the board, handle meeting prep, and keep me informed. I expect efficiency. Mistakes aren't tolerated." The words should have felt like a warning, yet there was something in his tone, an undercurrent of curiosity, maybe even challenge. Claire nodded, jotting notes though her mind was already racing. As she left the office, she knew what this meant. Nathaniel had moved her from the margins straight into his line of fire. Whatever game had begun in that first meeting was far from over. She tightened her grip on the folder in her hands, heart steadying. She had faced harder things than an office full of skeptics. Still, as the glass doors closed behind her, she felt the weight of what lay ahead. She wasn't just a secretary now. She was stepping into a storm that could tear her apart or force her to prove her worth in ways she never imagined. And Nathaniel Logan, with that sharp, unreadable gaze, was waiting at the center. The first strategy meeting with Claire, seated at the CEO's side, felt like a stage set for judgment. Executives filed into the boardroom with papers in hand and guarded expressions. Some glanced at her with faint amusement, as though waiting to see if the secretary would dare another stunt. Others ignored her completely, pretending she was no more than furniture in the room. Claire arranged her notes carefully, keeping her pen poised. Inside, her stomach churned, but outwardly she held still. She reminded herself that she had not come this far to disappear again. The agenda focused on a new acquisition, a grain processing plant 2 hours south in rural Minnesota. Slides flashed across the screen charts of projected profits, maps of distribution routes, estimates of labor cuts. The plan was efficient, ruthless, and, to Claire's eye, incomplete. Nathaniel opened the discussion with his usual composure. The facility is undervalued. Consolidating operations could save us millions annually. Logistics will be streamlined, overhead reduced. It's a straightforward acquisition. Executives nodded, some already scribbling approval notes. But Claire's gaze drifted back to the fine print of the proposal. She noticed the termination clauses buried deep in the contract, language that allowed the company to shut down with minimal warning, leaving workers adrift. She saw projections for environmental compliance numbers that seemed suspiciously low given the size of the plant. And she thought of the surrounding community, small towns that depended on those jobs, farmers who sold corn to the facility, local diners that thrived on factory paychecks. Her pen tapped softly against her notepad. She hesitated, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. This was not her place, not really. Yet silence now would be complicity. When the slide shifted to projected labor reductions, she spoke. Her voice was calm, measured, but it cut through the polished hum of business. Have we considered the impact on the local community? Hundreds of families depend on this plant. Closing operations would devastate not only employees, but the surrounding town. The termination terms give Logan Industries full discretion to exit without compensation. That's a risk, not only ethically, but reputationally. The room stilled, pens froze, heads turned toward her, some incredulous, some annoyed. Nathaniel's eyes sharpened. "Ms. Whitmore," he said evenly, "this is a strategy session, not a town hall. Explain precisely what risk you see." Claire lifted her notes, steadying her breath. "If we close abruptly, local media will seize the story. We'll be painted as the corporation that gutted small-town livelihoods. There's precedent articles from Iowa 2 years ago when another grain facility shut down under similar terms. Public outcry led to boycotts that cut revenue far more than the closure saved. And on the environmental side, she tapped the line of text. The compliance numbers don't match EPA standards for plants of this size. Cleanup costs could exceed estimates by millions. The words hung heavy. An executive scoffed. With respect, she's a secretary, not an analyst. But another frowned, flipping through the packet. She's right about the EPA benchmarks. These figures don't align. Murmurs spread. A director shifted in his chair, nodding reluctantly. Nathaniel's gaze didn't waver from her. His fingers drummed once against the table, then stilled. "You're suggesting we restructure the risk model," Claire forced herself to meet his eyes. "I'm suggesting we acknowledge the full cost, not just the purchase price, but the human and environmental consequences. If we ignore them, the financial fallout will come anyway, only later and larger." For a long moment, silence reigned. The only sound was the faint hum of the projector. Then Nathaniel leaned back, steepling his hands. "Update the model," he instructed his team. "Include community and environmental risk projections. We'll reconvene once it's complete." Gasps of quiet surprise circled the table. Some executives glanced at Claire with thinly veiled irritation, others with newfound respect. She kept her expression neutral, though inside she exhaled a long, trembling breath. The meeting moved on, but the air was changed. Claire had not only spoken, she had shifted the outcome. When it ended, Nathaniel closed his folder with deliberate calm. He didn't praise her, didn't chastise her, didn't betray what he thought. He merely looked at her, eyes unreadable, as though filing away a note for later. Claire gathered her papers with careful fingers. Her pulse still raced, but beneath it pulsed a spark of quiet satisfaction. She had not been silenced. She had not disappeared into the background. As she left the boardroom, she knew this was only the beginning. Nathaniel Logan was not a man who yielded easily. His decision to revise the plan was not concession, but curiosity, perhaps even challenge. And she, though trembling, had already stepped into the storm. The office was nearly empty by the time Claire packed her things. Lights glowed dim above the long hallway, casting pale reflections across the polished floor. Most assistants had gone home hours earlier. She remained, her desk a small island of quiet under the hum of fluorescent bulbs. She pulled a sandwich wrapped in wax paper from her bag, bread bought on discount, thin slices of turkey, a smear of mustard. It wasn't much, but it filled the silence. She bit slowly, mind still turning over the revisions she'd drafted that afternoon. Fairer termination clauses, balanced risk-sharing, language that respected both sides. She was scribbling final notes when a shadow crossed her desk. She looked up and froze. Nathaniel Logan stood there, jacket draped across his arm, tie loosened but posture still immaculate. His gaze flicked to the sandwich, then back to her face. He didn't speak, and for a moment the silence stretched between them like a wire pulled tight. Claire swallowed, setting the sandwich down. "Just finishing revisions?" she said softly. He studied her, expression unreadable. Then, without comment, he moved on down the hall, the sound of his shoes fading into the distance. Yet something in that pause lingered an acknowledgement unspoken. The next morning, Claire placed the revised contract on his desk. She had trimmed excess language, clarified obligations, and added provisions to safeguard the local workforce during transition. It was meticulous, precise, and she knew unorthodox. Secretaries weren't supposed to revise contracts. She braced for dismissal. Instead, Nathaniel scanned the pages, brow furrowed. He tapped the margin where she had inserted a fairness clause. "You added this?" "Yes," she said evenly. "It protects both parties. Less risk of litigation." He leaned back, silent. Then he gave the faintest nod. Noted. No praise, no rebuke, just recognition. It was enough to steady her. Later that week, she rode the bus home with grocery bags at her feet. The air smelled of rain, her coat damp at the shoulders. She counted change carefully at the checkout earlier, choosing store-brand cereal, discounted vegetables, milk near expiration. Every penny mattered. She thought of Nathaniel's kitchen marble counters, fruit laid out in crystal bowls, and felt the sharpness of contrast. Two lives, worlds apart, somehow crossing in a glass tower each morning. At home. She called her mother, listening to her voice fragile yet hopeful. They talked of doctor's appointments, of Ethan's essays, of small victories like a neighbor's soup left at the door. Claire listened more than she spoke, hiding the strain in her own voice. The next day, she arrived early again. Nathaniel summoned her to review talking points for an upcoming negotiation. His office smelled faintly of cedar polish and strong coffee. She sat across from him, sliding a chart across the desk. "This model shows reputational exposure if closures proceed without transition plans," she explained. He raised an eyebrow. "Exposure quantified how?" She walked him through the data she had gathered: local news archives, employment statistics, community impact studies, numbers, yes, but also stories hidden inside them, families displaced, towns struggling. For the first time, she saw something shift in his expression. A flicker of surprise, perhaps even respect. He didn't interrupt, didn't dismiss. He listened, and then, unexpectedly, he smiled. Not the sharp and strategic curve she'd seen him use in public, but something smaller, unguarded. "Interesting," he said quietly. The word was simple, but to Claire it was a crack in the ice. From then on, tasks changed. Instead of routine scheduling, she was handed access to deeper files, backgrounds of partner companies, negotiation drafts. Nathaniel asked for her input not as an afterthought, but as if her perspective mattered. He still kept his distance, still measured every word. Yet there was a shift, a thin line of trust beginning to form. That evening, she left the building with her coat clutched tight, heart unsettled. She knew the dangers of hope, knew better than to mistake curiosity for care. Still, she replayed that smile in her mind as she boarded the late bus. For the first time, the city lights outside the window looked less harsh. Claire didn't fool herself into thinking she was safe. She had been given a seat closer to the fire, nothing more. Yet she couldn't deny it, something fragile had begun to change. And Nathaniel Logan, whether he admitted it or not, had just let her step closer to the center of his world. Rain tapped steadily against the tall windows of Logan Industries Tower. The city beyond was blurred in streaks of silver and gold, streetlights smudged by the downpour. Inside the conference room, only 2 lamps glowed, casting pools of yellow light across piles of contracts and open laptops. It was late. The building was nearly empty. Claire sat with her sleeves rolled, pen poised, eyes tired but alert. Across the table, Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, jacket folded beside him, shirt cuffs undone. For once, the sharp polish of the day had softened. They had been parsing through language for hours, liquidated damages, supplier rights, indemnity clauses. But somewhere between clauses and footnotes, the conversation slowed. Claire set down her pen. Her gaze lingered on the rain-tracing paths down the glass. Words formed on her tongue before she could stop them. "My father owned a sawmill once," she said quietly. "Small, local, nothing compared to the companies you work with. But it mattered. It was his life." Nathaniel looked up, expression unreadable. "He lost it when I was in high school," she continued. "A larger distributor squeezed him on contracts, drove down prices until he couldn't cover costs. One winter, he had to choose between payroll and keeping the lights on at home." She paused, breath hitching. "He paid his men. We sat in the dark for weeks. And still, the mill closed." The words hung in the air, carried by the rhythm of rain. Claire traced the edge of a page with her finger, grounding herself. "I remember watching him change after that. He stopped laughing, stopped believing in fairness. He died young. I think the failure killed him long before his body gave out." Silence settled. Nathaniel's eyes held hers, steady, intense. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. "My father ran this company before me. He built it, brick by brick. People call him a visionary. They don't see the cost." His voice was low, edged with something Claire hadn't heard before. Vulnerability. "When he looked at me," Nathaniel went on, "I always felt measured, weighed. Never enough, unless the numbers were perfect. Shareholders still carry his expectations like a ghost in the room. Every quarter, every deal, I hear his voice, asking if I'll be the one to ruin his legacy." Claire studied him in the muted light. She had imagined him untouchable, carved from steel. But here, beneath the patter of rain, she saw the pressure pressing against him, the shadows he carried. Their gazes met, and for the first time, it wasn't a clash. It was recognition. 2 wounds, different yet alike. A daughter who had lost her father to ruthless business. A son who lived chained to his father's shadow. Both bearing scars that contracts could not conceal. Nathaniel leaned forward slightly, forearms on the table. His voice softened. "That's why you challenge me, isn't it? Because you've seen what happens when companies crush the little guy?" Claire nodded. "And that's why you resist me. Because you can't separate yourself from the empire he left behind." He exhaled, a sound almost like a laugh, but weary. Perhaps for a while. They said nothing. The rain filled the silence, steady and relentless. It was not uncomfortable. It was something else. A quiet space where words were no longer armor. Claire reached for another contract, but her hands moved slower now. "I didn't mean to bring personal history into work," she murmured. "Sometimes it's the only thing that makes sense of the work." Nathaniel replied. Her eyes flicked up. He was watching her. And there was no calculation in his gaze, only honesty. The moment stretched, delicate as glass. Neither moved closer, neither dared. Yet warmth flickered, unspoken, in the hush of midnight and rain. The clock on the wall ticked toward 1. Nathaniel gathered the papers into a neat stack. "That's enough for tonight," he said, though his voice carried no command, only weariness. Claire packed her notes slowly. The rain had eased, drumming softer against the glass. She slipped on her coat, buttoning it with careful fingers. At the door, she glanced back. Nathaniel was still seated, eyes on the city beyond, expression unreadable. But when he turned, just for a second, the corners of his mouth lifted, not a smile meant for show, something quieter, almost human. They left the office together, footsteps echoing down the empty hall. No words were spoken, yet the silence between them was full. On the elevator ride down, Claire felt the weight of possibility, not a promise, not even a plan, just a fragile warmth, born of shared truth. As they stepped into the damp night air, the city lights glimmering through mist, Claire knew one thing. This had been more than work, and though neither of them said it, the silence carried a promise of its own. The archive room smelled faintly of dust and ink. Rows of gray cabinets lined the narrow space, each drawer labeled in neat black print. It was late afternoon, the building quieter than usual, and Claire had been asked to fetch minutes from an old board meeting. She pulled at a drawer. It stuck halfway, then gave with a groan of metal. Papers shifted, a folder sliding loose and tumbling to the floor. The sound of cardboard thudding against tile startled her. She bent down quickly, gathering scattered sheets. The paper was dry, edges yellowed. She expected routine ledgers, perhaps forgotten correspondence. But as she stacked the pages, a phrase caught her eye. Whitmore Lumber Company. Her hand froze. She read again, heart lurching. There it was, printed in cold type, the name of her father's sawmill. The pages detailed acquisition strategies, notes on undervaluing assets, recommendations to pressure suppliers until contracts failed. Her father's ruin, laid out like a blueprint. Her breath quickened, the words blurred. She pressed her hand to the cabinet to steady herself. All these years, she had believed it was bad luck, market shifts, maybe even her father's missteps. And now, here it was. Logan Industries had orchestrated his downfall. The silence of the room closed in, broken only by her ragged breaths and the shuffle of paper. She clutched the folder, trembling, and walked straight to Nathaniel's office. He was standing by the window when she entered, phone pressed to his ear. He turned at her abrupt arrival, eyebrows lifting. Claire. She dropped the folder onto his desk. The papers fanned across the polished wood, stark under the light. "Explain this." He glanced down. Recognition flickered. His jaw tightened. He ended the call without a word and set the phone aside. "These are old," he said finally. His voice was steady, too steady. Her chest burned. "They're not just old. They're my father's company. You destroyed him." Nathaniel's expression shifted, a flicker of something guilt or anger. She couldn't tell. That was before my time. My father oversaw those acquisitions. I inherited the strategy. Claire shook her head, disbelief sharp as glass. "You've been CEO for years. You can't tell me you didn't know. I knew the numbers, the profits, the policies already in motion." His voice hardened, defensive now. "I carried the responsibility of protecting shareholders. Ending those practices overnight wasn't possible." Her voice trembled, rising. "You carried responsibility. My father carried shame to his grave. He thought he had failed us. He died believing he wasn't good enough because of this." She slapped the page with her palm, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Nathaniel flinched, just barely. The air between them thickened, his hands pressed against the edge of the desk, knuckles white. "You think I wanted this. You think I haven't questioned the legacy I was forced to uphold." Claire's eyes burned, but she refused to let tears fall. Questioning isn't the same as stopping. You profited from their pain. From my family's pain, the room felt smaller. The city lights beyond the glass blurred. Nathaniel's voice dropped, quieter, almost pleading. "I've been working to change things, slowly, carefully. If I move too fast, I lose control, and then nothing changes at all. She stared at him, every fiber torn between the man she had glimpsed beneath the armor and the truth laid bare in her hands. You want sympathy for moving slow? My father didn't have time for your patience. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. No words came. Claire gathered the papers, shoving them back into the folder with trembling fingers. I can't do this, she whispered. Not anymore. Claire. His voice broke through the stillness, sharp, almost desperate. She shook her head, stepping back. Whatever this is between us, it ends here. I won't be the woman who forgets what you represent. The look on his face nearly stopped her. Shock. Then a flash of regret. Then something heavier. Unspoken. But she turned away before it could undo her resolve. She left the office, folder clutched to her chest, footsteps echoing down the hall. Each step felt like tearing away a piece of herself. Behind her, Nathaniel stood alone. He moved to the window, resting a hand against the cool glass. The city stretched below, lights flickering against the evening sky. For the first time, doubt pressed hard against the steel walls he had built around his life. The reflection staring back at him was not just the heir to an empire. It was a man standing on a path he no longer trusted. Claire laid her badge on the polished desk, the lanyard coiling softly beside it. No ceremony, no goodbye party, only the quiet finality of a decision she could not undo. She pressed the elevator button, heart pounding as the doors slid open. When the metal doors closed between her and the world she had just abandoned, relief and grief mingled in her chest. She had chosen to step away from Logan Industries, away from the glass walls and the weight of betrayal. For now, survival meant distance. Outside, evening air bit against her skin. She wrapped her coat tighter and walked toward the bus stop. The city lights stretched long shadows across the pavement. Each footstep echoed in her chest, heavy with the cost of walking away. Life shrank quickly back into its old rhythm. Morning meant a crowded bus, the hiss of brakes, the scent of wet wool. She sat by the window, forehead against cool glass, watching the city blur past. At home, pill bottles still lined the counter, bills still waited in accusing stacks. The only difference was the absence of possibility, the sense that, for a while, she had glimpsed another world. Nights were harder, sleep came fitfully, broken by memories she tried to push aside. Her father's name on those papers, Nathaniel's face, unreadable as she walked out. She replayed their late-night conversations, the fragile warmth that had almost grown into something real, and then she reminded herself it had been built on a lie. Meanwhile, Nathaniel moved through his mansion like a ghost. The house by the lake, once immaculate, now felt cavernous. He poured a glass of whiskey at night, the amber liquid catching light from the fire, but it did little to silence the questions crowding his thoughts. He stood at the window often, watching ripples spread across the dark water. For the first time, the empire he had inherited felt like a weight he could not justify. His father's shadow no longer inspired, it accused. And Claire's absence cut deeper than he had expected. She had walked away in silence, leaving him with nothing but doubt. That silence haunted him more than any accusation. For Claire, silence was different. It became a kind of healing. She found rhythm in small acts, folding laundry, boiling pasta, writing lists she might never finish. The simplicity grounded her, yet under every ordinary task lay the ache of disappointment. One night, after tucking receipts into a shoebox, she sat by the window of her small apartment. Streetlights hummed outside, their glow spilling across cracked plaster walls. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and let her mind drift back to the night. Rain had tapped the glass in Nathaniel's office. When he had spoken of his father's expectations, she wondered if he remembered too, or if she had become only a cautionary note in his ledger. Nathaniel remembered. He remembered the fire in her eyes when she defended her father's memory. He remembered the sound of her voice pointing out risks others ignored. More than that, He remembered the silence after she left. In meetings, he found himself distracted. Numbers blurred, voices droned. He no longer trusted the ease with which he once dismissed consequences. Every decision carried the echo of her words. One afternoon, a report crossed his desk. Another acquisition, another town, another calculated profit. He read the proposal once, twice, then, without explanation. He closed the folder and set it aside. Cancel it, he told his team. The room went still. Executives exchanged glances, confused, but Nathaniel's tone left no room for argument. The deal died quietly, though whispers spread quickly through the tower. Claire heard the rumors days later on the bus. A headline glimpsed in a folded newspaper, "Logan Industries pulls out of controversial deal." Her chest tightened. She folded her arms, staring out the window as the bus jolted forward. She told herself it was coincidence, that Nathaniel had acted from calculation, not conscience, and yet, part of her wondered. The distance between them remained, filled with silence. But in that silence, something had begun to shift, not only in him, but in her. The path ahead was uncertain. What she knew for sure was, this walking away had not ended the story. It had only carved a pause, heavy with questions neither of them yet had the courage to answer. The newspaper headline stopped her mid-sip. Claire set her coffee mug down on the chipped kitchen table, eyes scanning the bold print, "Logan Industries cancels aggressive deal. Announces supplier support program." Her heart thudded harder. She read every word twice, almost disbelieving. The article described a new initiative funding lines for small vendors, flexible contracts to protect local suppliers from collapse. Words she had once begged to see in boardroom drafts now appeared in ink for the public. She leaned back in her chair, mug cooling beside her. Was it real reform, or simply another corporate performance polished for headlines that afternoon? She overheard conversations at the community center, where her mother sometimes attended wellness classes. A man who ran a bakery supplier spoke with cautious relief. Logan had extended credit terms, saving him from closing his doors. Another woman said her husband, a truck driver, had been promised job stability through a revised logistics plan. Claire listened quietly, arms folded, hope and doubt colliding in her chest. Meanwhile, her days still revolved around the hospital. The scent of disinfectant clung to every hallway. Fluorescent lights hummed, their cold brightness relentless. Machines beeped softly beside her mother's bed, marking each fragile beat. On a Tuesday morning, Claire sat in a molded plastic chair with a magazine unopened on her lap. She had memorized the pattern of announcements over the loudspeaker visiting hours. Code calls, reminders for staff. Each word seemed amplified in the sterile air. When footsteps echoed down the corridor, she lifted her head and froze. Nathaniel stood there, framed by the pale glow of the overhead lamps. He wore no boardroom mask, no tailored distance. His eyes searched for hers, and when they met, something unspoken passed between them. For a moment, Claire forgot to breathe. He didn't move closer, not immediately. Instead, he lingered near the nurse's station, speaking briefly to a staff member. His presence was quiet, almost hesitant, but unmistakable. Finally, he walked toward her. "I heard about your mother," he said softly, stopping a careful distance away. His voice carried none of the steel she remembered from the tower. It held weight, but also gentleness. Claire tightened her grip on the magazine, knuckles pale. She wanted to ask why he was there, whether this was guilt or calculation, but the words tangled in her throat. Nathaniel glanced toward the room where her mother rested. The new supplier program. It isn't just numbers on a page. People are already benefiting. Families are safer. Jobs preserved. Claire studied his face, searching for the familiar armor, the sharp edge of corporate detachment. Instead, she saw fatigue etched at the corners of his eyes, and something that looked disarmingly like sincerity. The silence stretched, filled with the distant rhythm of a heart monitor. He lowered his voice. "I didn't come here to ask for forgiveness. I came because You should know change is possible, even here. Her chest tightened. Part of her longed to believe him, to let hope slip past the walls she had built. Another part whispered caution, promises had broken her family before. She looked away, focusing on the bland tile floor. Why now? Nathaniel hesitated. Because the cost of waiting became unbearable. Their eyes met again. For a fleeting instant, the world outside the hospital corridor faded. The shareholders, the contracts, the ghosts of the past. What remained was two people standing on the fragile edge of trust, wondering if it could hold. Claire didn't answer. She couldn't. But when he left, she noticed the nurses spoke differently about Logan Industries. They mentioned new health coverage expansions, hazard pay adjustments, scholarships for staff children. These were not distant reforms. They were immediate, tangible, touching lives she could see and hear. That night, as she walked home under the buzz of street lamps, Claire's thoughts refused to settle. She had witnessed change not in press releases, but in the gratitude of strangers. And yet, the question gnawed at her, was Nathaniel acting out of conscience, or out of some lingering tie to her? The uncertainty followed her into sleep, where dreams blurred the lines between past betrayals and future possibilities. When morning came, the coffee tasted different, not sweeter, not bitter, simply sharper, alive with questions that demanded answers. For the first time in weeks, Claire found herself wondering not just what she had lost, but what might still be rebuilt. The headline hit like a fist. Claire froze on the sidewalk outside the hospital, her hands trembling as she unfolded the paper someone had left on a bench. In bold, lurid letters, it screamed, "Poor secretary manipulates billionaire CEO." Her stomach turned. The article sprawled across 2 pages, complete with photos taken without her knowing, walking out of a bus, carrying grocery bags, holding her mother's arm as they entered the clinic. The words were cruel, twisting every detail of her life into a narrative of seduction and ambition. Flashbulbs confirmed the damage was real. Reporters had gathered at her mother's apartment building, shouting questions, cameras flashing so hard she had to shield her mother's eyes. Is it true you influenced Logan's reforms for personal gain? Did you use your relationship to sabotage shareholder value? The barrage was relentless. Doors slammed. Voices followed her down the hallways, and Claire's every breath felt stolen. Inside the boardrooms of Logan Industries, another storm raged. Harrington Global had been quietly buying shares for months. Their intentions finally revealed. With nearly 35% secured, they positioned themselves for a hostile takeover. Their narrative aligned seamlessly with the tabloids. Logan's leadership compromised by a woman from nowhere. His reforms reckless. His judgment unstable. Nathaniel faced his directors in a meeting that stretched into midnight. The walls of the boardroom glowed with charts and shareholder tallies. Every line a battlefield. Gregory Pierce's voice cut sharp. This scandal undermines our credibility. Investors demand stability. If Logan cannot provide it, Harrington will. Eleanor Grayson leaned forward, her tone icy. No one questions the sincerity of your reforms, Nathaniel. But perception matters more than intention. And perception right now is that you've lost control. Nathaniel sat straight, jaw tight. He spoke with measured calm, but each word carried steel. We are not for sale. These reforms are not reckless. They are strategic. They safeguard long-term value by protecting the very communities that sustain us. Harrington trades in destruction. We will not follow their model. The boardroom grew tense. Some nodded reluctantly. Others whispered doubts. The vote came down to the wire. 7 members supported him. 6 demanded resignation. He survived, but barely. The condition was clear: no more scandals. Any further disruption, and the board would side with Harrington. News of the vote leaked by morning. Claire read it online, her chest tightening with guilt. The implication was unmistakable. She had become the scandal. Her presence gave rivals ammunition. Every headline dragged her name. Every rumor fed the fire. At her mother's bedside, She listened to the faint rhythm of machines and wondered if walking away again was the only way to protect not just herself, but the fragile reforms Nathaniel had begun. Nathaniel, however, stood at the tall windows of his office, staring down at the city. For the first time, he felt the company slipping from his grasp, not because of numbers, but because of perception shaped by shadows. The click of cameras outside his home, the sting of betrayal in the market, and in the center of it all, the woman he could neither abandon nor protect. For Claire, the realization came quietly, without drama. She folded the newspaper late at night, placed it on the kitchen counter, and whispered to herself, "If I stay, I become the excuse they need to undo everything." The thought chilled her more than the headlines. And so, the silence between them deepened, not from lack of love, but from the weight of enemies pressing closer. The door opened, and Nathaniel stood there. Claire hadn't expected to see him in the modest office she now occupied at the non-profit legal clinic. He filled the space with his presence, yet his voice was steady, almost restrained. "I'm not here for us," he said. "I'm here because thousands of jobs are on the line." The words settled heavy between them. Claire folded her arms, guarding herself against the rush of old emotions. "What do you want from me?" she asked quietly. "I need your expertise. Harrington is tightening their hold. The board won't resist them much longer. Unless we build a legal wall, the company and everything we've worked for will fall." Her instinct was to refuse. Pride whispered that returning would mean surrendering dignity, reopening wounds that had barely begun to scar. But beneath that pride lay the faces of workers she had met: the truck driver's wife, the supplier clinging to his bakery, their livelihoods balanced on decisions made in glass towers. Claire closed her eyes briefly, then opened them with resolve. "I'll help. But this isn't about you and me. This is about them." Nathaniel nodded. Relief flickered across his features. Agreed. That night, they sat across from each other in his office once more. The long table between them was stacked with binders, contracts, and statutory codes. Outside, the city lights glittered across the dark skyline. Inside, the air hummed with the low whir of a desk lamp. Claire flipped through pages, tracing clauses with her finger. Traditional defenses won't hold. Harrington has already aligned proxies. We need something structural, something that makes takeover against the workers' own interest. Nathaniel leaned forward, meaning she tapped a paragraph. Employee ownership. If we can transfer significant shares into an employee trust, their voting bloc becomes decisive. Harrington can't override people who refuse to sell. Nathaniel absorbed the idea, his brow furrowed. It's bold. It changes the entire structure of control. It also buys time, Claire said, and it aligns the reforms with those most invested in keeping them alive, the workforce. They sat in silence for a moment, the magnitude of the gamble sinking in. Through the long hours, they worked side by side, carefully mapping scenarios. Claire drafted outlines of trust agreements, highlighting risks. Nathaniel calculated potential shareholder backlash, financial costs, the optics of announcing such a radical plan. Their interactions remained professional, but beneath the surface, old currents stirred. She noticed the way he paused to refill her water glass without comment. He noticed how she pressed her lips when concentrating, the same way she had months ago when dismantling a flawed contract. At 2 a.m, papers scattered across the table. Claire leaned back with a sigh. It won't be easy, but it's possible. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. His eyes met hers across the sea of documents. For the first time in weeks, their gaze held not in accusation, but in recognition of shared purpose. The twist had arrived not in passion, but in clarity. The answer lay in placing power into the hands of workers, a shield no corporate raider could easily dismantle. Claire gathered her notes into neat piles, her movements deliberate. If we're doing this, we need to move fast. Harrington won't wait. Nathaniel straightened, resolve sharpening his features. Then we make our move before they make theirs. The night ended without promises, without the warmth of reconciliation. Yet, as they left the building side by side, Their silence felt different, not fractured, but bound by urgency. The storm outside had not passed, but they had chosen to face it together with a gamble that could either save everything or end it all. The shareholder hall was full to the brim. Rows of chairs pressed shoulder to shoulder, air heavy with cologne, coffee, and expectation. On each table, the voting cards lay untouched, stark against polished wood. The hum of the air conditioner was drowned out by the thrum of nerves. Claire sat near the front, her notes spread neatly. She could hear her own heartbeat, fast and insistent. Nathaniel rose at the podium, tall against the screen, where charts glowed in cool blue. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice rang steady, "we face a choice. Sell our future to Harrington Global or build a structure that protects our people, our partners, and our company's soul." Murmurs rippled across the room. He clicked to the next slide. Employee Stock Ownership Program. 30% equity transfer. Claire felt the weight of eyes turning. She inhaled and began to speak, her voice calm but firm. "This plan is not charity. It is not sentiment. It is lawfully sound. Rooted in statutes, Congress itself encouraged to stabilize industry. By granting employees meaningful ownership, we align incentives, reduce litigation risk, and ensure continuity." A Harrington lawyer leapt up, waving papers. "This is reckless. We've filed an injunction to halt this vote. This maneuver violates fiduciary duty." Claire stood, spine straight. Her tone was measured, but steel-lined each word. "Your motion lacks standing. The courts have repeatedly upheld ESOPs when structured transparently. We have compliance audits in place. The claim is not only premature, it is baseless." The room stilled. Even the board leaned forward, pens stilled in their hands. Nathaniel added quietly, "We are not weakening the company. We are strengthening it by giving the very people who drive our success a real stake in its future." Silence followed, then a slow clap began from the back. Employees filled the gallery section, workers from warehouses, drivers, clerks. One by one, the sound grew, until applause filled the hall. The vote proceeded. Cards raised, tally counted, numbers projected. 87% of employees supported the transfer. Combined with Nathaniel's personal shares, it secured a majority. Harrington's block, though substantial, collapsed against the unified wall of workers. Claire exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath. Nathaniel's hand tightened briefly on the edge of the podium, but his face remained controlled. Across the room, Harrington's representatives seethed, their polished confidence cracked. The lawyer who had waived the injunction slumped into his chair. Defeated, the market reacted within hours. News outlets flashed breaking updates. Logan Industries defends independence. Analysts who had once scoffed at Nathaniel's sentimental reforms now praised the stability of engaged employees. Stock prices rose, modest but steady. The narrative shifted. Nathaniel stood before the crowd again. "Today, we proved that ethics and profit need not be enemies. Today, this company belongs not only to shareholders in distant cities, but to the people who open warehouses at dawn, who deliver goods in snow, who process contracts long after dark." The applause this time was thunderous. Claire remained in her seat, her eyes fixed on the table before her. Relief washed over her, but it came with exhaustion, and a question that refused to fade. When the meeting adjourned, Nathaniel found her near the exit. His expression held triumph, but also vulnerability. "It worked," he said softly. "It did." She answered. They stood in the swirl of departing voices, neither reaching for the other. What they had fought for was bigger than them, and it was safe now. Yet between them stretched an unfinished space. The battle for the company was won, but the battle for their future, what it could be, if it could be, remained. And as they walked out under the same heavy sky, that unanswered question followed them like a shadow. The church was old, its wooden beams darkened by time, its windows plain but bright with morning light. Wildflowers rested in jars along the aisle, their colors soft, their scent fresh. Guests filled the pews, Not in tuxedos or gowns, but in work jackets, pressed shirts, and dresses worn with care. Men and women who had once stood on opposite sides of boardroom battles now sat shoulder to shoulder. Shareholders, warehouse clerks, drivers, lawyers, all together. Claire walked slowly down the aisle, her hand resting on her mother's arm. Margaret's health was steadier now, her steps sure, her smile wide. Ethan walked ahead, holding a simple wooden cross carved from the remains of the old family workshop. At the altar, Nathaniel waited. His suit was tailored but modest, his eyes fixed on her with quiet reverence. No cameras, no spectacle, only the two of them, and a room filled with the people whose lives had been touched by their choices. The vows were brief, the promises plain. No one spoke of wealth or power. They spoke only of honesty, of courage, of walking together even when paths grew rough. When Nathaniel slipped the ring onto Claire's finger, she felt not just his hand, but the weight of every moment that had led them here, the long nights, the broken trust, the improbable healing. The applause that followed was not loud, but steady. It felt like a heartbeat, binding everyone present. Afterward, tables were set outside under oak trees. Wooden benches held plates of roasted chicken, bowls of salad, bread still warm. Children ran between rows, laughter echoing against the stone walls of the churchyard. Nathaniel lifted his glass. This company, our company, has survived storms. It is stronger now because we chose to believe in people. Claire taught me that. And today, together, we are beginning not just a marriage, but a promise to keep building what matters. Claire rose next. Her voice was soft but carried. Years ago, I walked into a room where no one expected me to speak, and when I did, the room fell silent, not because of me, but because truth has a way of asking to be heard. That moment changed my life, and I hope the work we do now will give others the same chance to be heard, to be respected, to be free to dream. Applause rose again, mingled with tears. Later, under the shade, they unveiled the new foundation, a legal support fund for small businesses. Logan Industries would finance it, but Claire would lead it. She had already begun assembling a team of lawyers willing to fight for shopkeepers, artisans, families like her own once had been. The announcement brought cheers, but also a deep, quiet relief. For many in attendance, it was more than charity. It was a safety net woven from lessons hard learned. As evening light slanted across the grass, Claire and Nathaniel shared their first dance. No orchestra, only a single violin played by a worker's daughter. The melody was simple, tender, and it carried them gently in each other's arms. Claire leaned her head against his chest. For the first time, she felt no wall between them. Nathaniel whispered, "This is the real beginning." She smiled. Yes, a beginning we built together. The celebration stretched into twilight, lanterns glowing softly, voices rising in song. Around them, community took shape not just in contracts or policies, but in laughter, in shared meals, in the joining of lives. And as Claire looked out over the faces gathered, the young, the old, the weary, the hopeful, she thought back to that first morning when she had stepped into Logan Tower with worn shoes and a borrowed blouse. She remembered how her voice had cut through a room of power, how silence had fallen. That silence had been the seed. From it had grown change, struggle, loss, and finally, renewal. Now, with Nathaniel's hand warm in hers, with wildflowers nodding in the evening breeze, she knew the story was not about a takeover prevented, or even a marriage begun. It was about courage, about the willingness of one ordinary secretary to speak, and the willingness of a man shaped by privilege to listen. A new era stretched before them, not perfect, not certain, but full of possibility. And in that fragile, beautiful space, a different kind of power was born, the kind that promised not wealth, but hope. Life has a way of reminding us that true strength does not always come from power, wealth, or titles. It often rises quietly from courage, honesty, and compassion. Claire's story shows us that even the most ordinary voice can echo through the walls of power when spoken with conviction. She was not armed with money or influence, but with integrity, and that became the force that shifted lives. Nathaniel's journey reminds us of another truth, that it is never too late to change. Even those shaped by legacy and hardened by ambition can discover a different path, if they are willing to listen, to question, and to choose conscience over convenience. Together, their story teaches us that healing begins when we dare to face the past and rebuild trust, not only with others, but within ourselves. And perhaps the most powerful lesson of all is this: love and justice are not separate roads. When joined, they create a foundation strong enough to carry both people and communities forward. So, in our own lives, may we never underestimate the quiet courage of speaking up, the humility of listening, and the grace of choosing what is right over what is easy. Thank you, dear friends, for spending your precious time with us and walking through this journey of courage, love, and second chances. Your presence here means more than words can say. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like, share it with someone who might need its message, and don't forget to subscribe to Shining Stories so you'll never miss the next tale. Together, let's keep spreading light, one story at a time.